Everyone, this is Yoga again, and we are connecting on the last session, the third and last day of second edition of Global Soccer Conclave. Just to touch upon what has happened so far in the day. It all started with data-driven decision making in Hall 1, where it was predominantly discussed about data for the use of player and team performance, analytics, fan engagement, and revenue generation. And then in Hall 2, we had a great panel on how today's sports journalism and how sports presentation has evolved over years and how it's helping to tackle the situations like pandemic without the fans. And then we saw Red and Blue Ocean football business on how the industry is currently working and constantly trying to get innovative ways of bringing the capital into sports. Lately, we have just started GSC Kickoff, which is sports tech brands presenting their ideas for improvement of the game, both in the performance and business side of the sport. But all this is great. But what about talking about literally the people who conduct the game on the field? And here we are, the match official and referee panel. So today the focus area of this session is actually going to be on referee education programs and recent developments, adapting to the use of VAR and goal line technology, tackling the abuses from various aspects of football fans, and maintaining health and fitness amidst fixed condition. So I welcome you all to the panel. Here we have Mr. Keith Hackett. It would be great, Keith, if you can go on and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join your show. My brief is, I think, a relatively easy one in that I'm going to deal with the fitness, both physically, and I've no doubt Tom will go into the realms of mental fitness that's required for refereeing, certainly at the elite level. Mm-hmm. But you have to develop those skill sets as you develop your own career.
Right.
If we take a professional referee, we know that about 10 years ago, the change in the patterns of the game were quite enormous. We had the pass-back law that impacted greatly on referees.
Mm-hmm.
Up to that point, all our training, our physical training, was centered on endurance.
Mm-hmm.
So we would be running a great deal of distance, probably 90 minutes plus of just, if you like, plodding along, lapping up the miles as we build, if you like, our endurance within our framework of refereeing. It then changed. With the pass-back law, it became high impact. And we needed, at that stage, with the formation of the PGMOL, the first organization to deal with professional refereeing, we employed a sports scientist, Professor Matt Weston, who currently works with Pro Referee now in America. And we laid down very clear patterns of training and monitoring training, remembering that referees were only coming together every 2 weeks, but we need to input 4 training sessions of variable intensity into their programs. So as a consequence, we started to use polar heart monitors, which allowed us, when we had referees in remote at home, to be able to carry out their training sessions, which were detailed, and then to download that information and for us to interrogate their levels of fitness. We could do that. We could also put in, if you like, training programs, which are used today to measure what is in effect VO2 max, the oxygen, if you like, going around the body and how efficient that is. So to ensure that the criteria of a referee is met in terms of the initial decision-making process, a referee has to see, recognize, think, and then act. And if he fails to see, then there's an error.
Yeah.
Invariably an error. So we started to bring in sprint coaches to ensure that we were delivering high performance, explosive sprinting on the field of play. People like Howard Webb, who refereed the World Cup final in 2010, Mark Clattenburg, Mark Halsey and others, would move from penalty area to penalty area in 11 seconds comfortably.
Wow, that's amazing.
When we started to measure through a product Prozone the relationship of the referee's performance against that of players, one of the things that was very noticeable was that the players were averaging somewhere in around about 40, 45 sprints per game, and our average was 25. So the whole aspect then was to bring in a sprint coach to improve and increase the agility aspect of the referee. But also we wanted, because of the increasing pressure put on refereeing, we needed to look at sports psychology to link up with the sports science in terms of the physical side, to make certain that the capacity of that individual referee, his own personality, how he interacted with players, and how he dealt with pressure. So we went with a sports science, psychologist, Professor Craig Mahoney, and he would run regular sessions. I wasn't there. The agreement was that he would come in and it would be private amongst himself and refereeing. But we saw then a noticeable improvement in terms of referees, when they make an error, it can easily debilitate the next decision. And therefore, the whole aspect of the psychology within refereeing is important because it prepares the referee to deal with aspects of performance. The other side of it was I officiated at the Seoul Olympics in 1988, and rather than sitting in a chair comfortably in the hotel having done my training sessions or refereed the games, I decided to start to interrogate some of the coaches of the athletics in particular. And that's when, if you like, I was introduced to visualization.
Oh.
And this aspect of refereeing is really important within the process of a referee's development. You know, I would drive, of course, I wasn't personally a full-time referee, but I would drive from my home to my office, which was 4 hours, and to pass the time of day and to improve my officiating, I would visualize certain things like a mass confrontation or decisions around the penalty area, or visualizing a particular player and how I was going to deal with it. Because we had, as the game always will have, difficult players who want to tell you how to referee. So the whole aspect of the preparation of a referee is vital. Preparation to carry out what ought to be a relatively simple task of making a decision. It's a free kick or it's not a free kick, and the laws of the game come into that. But it's a foundation of preparing a referee to do his job. And then we switched to group meetings where we would look at decision making. This is about balance. The good decisions that are made by referees, a terrific advantage or a great interaction with a player, or movement on the field of play that gets the right viewing angle. All those aspects would then be brought together where we had an open and frank discussion. The group of professional referees would learn off each other. There was a competitive element, but there was always a willingness to actually offer advice. And so when young people like Howard Webb and Mark Clattenburg joined that group, of the likes of Graham Poll and others, and Graham Barber and other English referees that were at the top of their game, their learning process became much quicker.
Yeah.
The training on the field of play, if you like, was good. And then we looked at, with a sports psychologist, how we could improve our communication. You know, let me give you a simple example. So a player is causing you some concern.
Yeah.
You know, he's putting 2 or 3 foul challenges. I see often referees going to that player and saying, the next time I'm going to give you a yellow card. And then what that does is it closes off the options of that referee.
Yeah.
Because the next time, if he fails to issue the yellow card, then he has lost, if you like, some status within the group of fans that are watching and the players on the field of play, because all of a sudden he becomes a weak referee.
Yeah.
So it's much better to actually approach that player and to stay a good arm's length away from that player so that you're looking him in the eye, you know, and you're not calling him to you, by the way. I'm not saying come here. You're actually saying come and join me at point C on the triangle. If the player is at A, referee's at B, point C of the time, come and join me. And at that point, I would say to the player, I want an improvement. Simple. No threat. Just I want and expect an improvement. You're in my, if you like, sight line now, and one eye is going to keep focused on you. So I think these are aspects of refereeing that are important in the development of refereeing, not just purely physical, but also clearly understanding the laws of the game.
Yeah, great. Great.
And of course, Tom, I'm sure, will talk from his point of view, because he's an expert in his field, and I admire his expertise.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Keith.
I'm only too sorry that he wasn't around when I was boss of the PGM in that sense.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. I mean, you touched upon so many aspects of physical aspect of how you were interested in the game and how the physical aspects came in later. And also you touched upon the psychological and scientific aspects. But I'm now moving on to Tom Webb. He's a senior lecturer in sports management. He's a founder and coordinator of the Referee and Match Official Research Network. Well, just not that, he's also a senior lecturer with an extensive research and publication background in sports management, social science, and behavior insight. I welcome you, Tom Webb, to this conclave. So, Tom, here's my first question to you. What are the recent advancements in the field of referee education, and can you highlight the differences between FIFA referee programs versus the referee educational programs in different federations?
Well, thanks, Yogaraj, and thanks very much for the invitation, and great to be on here with Keith. And Keith and I have touched base over the years. It's great to see you again, Keith. Yeah, and I think Keith's really outlined succinctly and nicely there about what happened when he took over at PGMOL, and the evolution, if you like, of the training and development within the Premier League, which really was and has been cutting edge. We're really at the forefront of referee training development over the years, and Keith highlighted people like Howard Webb and Mark Clattenburg, and their achievements are testament to that, the programs that have been in place, and that doesn't happen by accident. It of course helps having the Premier League as such a competitive league, and the matches every single week, whether you're playing a top of the table game, if it's a relegation fixture, mid-table, it doesn't matter. That the competition is so fierce. It's such a strong league that every match presents challenges for both players and officials, and of course managers. In terms of their training and development, it does differ quite markedly. So each league there are cultural differences. So if we talk about the Premier League, for example, it's quite fast paced. There's historically more physical contact allowed, permitted, or expected even. And it is a very quick game. Now, if you move to sort of Italy, look at Serie A, for example, the game is slower. There's more technical fouls, perhaps. yellow cards, red cards are used slightly differently in Italian football, for example. Certainly, they're used much more as a deterrent at an early point in the game. So when I visited, I was fortunate enough to be invited to visit the Italian referees as part of their training program at Coverciano, and then collected data around that. And they were explaining to me the differences and between competitions and how they might behave culturally when they're in Serie A compared to when they might officiate in the Champions League, for example. And there are differences between competitions as well. So there's that to take into account. And of course, we're talking here about European football. I'm talking about Serie A, the Premier League, La Liga, for example. I was also fortunate enough to be invited to observe some referee training camps there, also in France, at Clairefontaine. And so what we see is that there are similarities, there are trends that cut across those education and performance pathways, but there are also subtle differences, and some of that can come from the personnel that are involved. So for example, in Italy, they have obviously personnel that are in charge of the physical training, the biomechanical training, and they have their own thoughts about how things might and should look, and the tests that they might administer in terms of fitness, and things like that. And then of course we have UEFA and FIFA, who sit above those organizations, and their requirements can differ as well in terms of what they might require from the fitness tests, in terms of the time taken to achieve certain aspects of the fitness tests, to the technical requirements and things like that. So of course there are differences between competitions, and we've seen that in a lot of the research we did a few years ago. And of course then you step outside of UEFA and you start looking at other confederations, CONCACAF, CAF, places like that around the world, and then we see even greater differences between the training and performance and development of referees. One of the main things and one of the main aims of organisations like UEFA and FIFA is to try and get towards this idea of uniformity, of standardisation, which is a fantastic thing to work towards. But whether it's actually achievable in reality is a different matter, because of some of the things I've outlined, such as cultural differences in the leagues. Just the way people behave in different countries is very different. The way players behave, of course, in different leagues and competitions ultimately will affect how referees deal with those players, the decisions they might give, and how they might manage those games. So it's great to have this aim of uniformity. I would argue that perhaps if we took into account a little bit more in terms of differences of culture, of how the game is played around the world, perhaps that might lead to even more improvements. Understanding that, if a player comes from another country, the differences in terms of the behaviour that's acceptable in football in that country compared to what might be acceptable in the Premier League, for example.
Yeah.
And there's been many examples of that. A good example to use now is Cristiano Ronaldo, who's just come back to the Premier League. And of course, when we saw Cristiano come over when he was, a younger footballer from Sporting Lisbon to Manchester United, in Portuguese league, simulation is much more acceptable. It's almost part of the game. Same in Italy, often in Spain as well. And when I say simulation, obviously I'm talking about diving. In the Premier League, it's much less acceptable. We don't really have a culture of simulation. We have this ethos of fair play. And so when Cristiano Ronaldo came to the Premier League, Alex Ferguson, the manager at the time, so Alex Ferguson was very quick to, say that we don't do that. You need to change behaviour. And you saw that in Ronaldo, and you saw his performances and how he then behaved and acted was very different. And then he goes to Spain, to Real Madrid, and the behaviour changes again because of what's acceptable in that competition. So, that's one example, but there are many, many examples of players coming to different leagues and behaviour changing. So yeah, there are big differences between different competitions and organisations in terms of the training and development of referees as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. You put it nicely in terms of the similarities and parities as well. Talking about the conduct of the game, of late, there have been a lot of technological advancements in the game. The game has evolved. Technology has come into the game. So how informed are the referees about the current technological advancements, and what are the challenges in coping up with them?
If I may, Tom, can I come in there? I think we go back some way with regard to how we as referees could learn from other sports. And I'll give you an example. First of all, we were looking at a linesman or an assistant referee from some distance and relying purely on communication by flag. And of course, there were breakdowns and there were errors. And so I introduced the communication kits, which are now standard around the world. And it was simple. I went to watch a rugby union game, at Twickenham. And as a result of that, we introduced the communication kit. If we moved into goal line technology, again, I put to the Premier League that there was one area of vulnerability for match officials, just one, but there's more. But certainly the one major vulnerability is the ability to be able to determine the ball has crossed the line. The reality is this, that when you look at it from a technological point of view, it is nigh impossible, given what is required to judge a ball crossing the goal line accurately. Now, I watched a game at Old Trafford where the ball clearly crossed the line. The goalkeeper dropped it over the line, but referee Mark Clattenburg was close to the halfway line, and the assistant referee was well up the field of play in the right positions that we would expect. But a snapshot on goal meant the referee dropped the ball. So we introduced goal line technology. And I worked with with Hawkeye on that, basically saying that we wanted to take the human being element out of that process. And that is why we have a level of accuracy on goal line technology within the Premier League. When it comes to VAR, again, I was a great supporter of VAR. In England, I think we're seeing it going through its learning stages still. You know, if we compare the English VAR system, it's been in operation now, I think it's in its third season. When we look at the tracking of the equivalent in rugby union, it's now probably in its 19th year. And it's gone through many changes, subtle changes. I think that we in England didn't introduce it as well as we could have, because I think we tried to make some changes to how we were going to operate it. We restricted, if you like, we almost failed to use the pitch side monitor. And the thing that I was concerned about was that whilst the decisions were still continuing to be of a relatively high standard, considering the number of decisions to be made, clearly in the eye of the spectator, the decisions were being made by someone in the office and not someone on the field of play. And the point of that was that when you're in a selling process, it's ideal for that referee to go and look at the monitor, to take ownership of the decision, even if it's a process. And a couple of weeks ago, I watched Anthony Taylor on a handball decision.
Chelsea Liverpool.
View the screen. He viewed the screen to sell the decision. He'd no need to go to the screen because he had a solid working relationship with the VAR, Chris Kavanagh. He'd worked with him in the Euros 2020s. It was evident to me as Anthony Taylor, a very experienced and top-class referee, was moving towards the monitor, that the decision was going to be handball and a red card. And it was an outstanding piece of how we use VAR.
What's in it, in your opinion? By rule book, it says the red card. What's in it? What was your opinion about it?
Oh, I think the decision by Anthony Taylor was the correct one. And I think that what we had was the difficulty of the handball law as it is currently penned. It's not an easy law to transmit onto the field of play. There was clearly movement by James, the player, towards the ball. He definitely made himself bigger in that process, and he prevented the ball going in the net. So in law terms, it was an easy decision. Selling that decision, I thought, was excellent. I thought he went through a perfect piece of process. Anthony Taylor, with great stature, sold the decision effectively. And it's taken us 3 years to get there. So technology moves on. We have to advance with it. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you said, what's the next piece of technology I want? Well, it's pretty simple, really. I want an offside call decision to be made purely by technology, not involving an assistant referee and not involving a referee.
Just like the line technology in US Open, for instance, the line calls in US Open. Yeah.
So I think that there's a coming together here of a rewriting of the law and the use of technology.
Perfect.
In order to try and simplify the task of the referee. We know that the technology on offside, I do anyway, know that the technology on offside is flawed as far as VAR is concerned. But again, what I think is important is to see how you adjust to the difficulties that have been experienced. And this season, again, the PGMOL, recognising there was a problem, seeing what UEFA had done with the broadening of the broadcast line on offside, we're now getting more acceptable decisions. And that's how technology and the management process of an organisation has to move on. And it's so important. I think Tom's raised a very valid issue because I too, as a UEFA delegate and as a referee expert on UEFA, helped to pen what effectively was the referee convention. And that was based on how referees train, how we can develop referees, down to referee recruitment and retention, all important matters within refereeing to ensure that, if you like, the smaller countries within Europe were securing sufficient funding from UEFA to bring them in line with some of the more traditionally big countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, and England in that process. So countries like Norway, Denmark, Andorra, and others, smaller countries, if I can call them smaller countries, smaller number of referees were able to take advantage of that. I also believe that, and Tom touched on it, the importance of UEFA developing the referees themselves and taking them to that international level, UEFA and FIFA. And I think UEFA and FIFA do a pretty good job.
Great. Thanks, Keith. On this aspect, we were talking a brief about VAR and goal line technology. Tom, VAR and goal line technology is quite settled in developed ecosystems like in Europe, but why in your eyes is there's no goal line technology or VAR for example, like World Cup qualifiers or like other top tier competitions in Asia and Africa? Is it just due to the financial aspect, or is it like reluctance to adapt the systems?
Yeah, of course, money comes into it. It was in the Premier League because there's a lot of money in the Premier League, and they can afford to put it into stadiums. Effectively, that's the reason. And VAR's there because the Premier League can afford to have more officials, and officials sat in separate control centres overseeing the VAR process. Now that gets more difficult for some leagues, and as Keith mentioned, the bigger leagues, as they would be termed in European football, of course, can implement these systems because the finances are there. Once you go outside those leagues, it does become more difficult because some of the other leagues don't have those resources. And so the UEFA, FIFA, those sorts of organisations, they also will look at, where do we need this technology the most? And so, FIFA will be looking at, well, we need it at the World Cup. We need it at our flagship tournament, UEFA European Championships. Of course, what happens is when we play qualifiers for those tournaments, yes, you will play at Wembley and the technology may well be available in those games, but you will also play, for example, in places like Andorra, where the technology isn't going to be available and the money isn't there to support that system or process. So, of course, that comes into the decision making of national FAs, of UEFA and FIFA as well. And it's really important to say when we're talking about VAR and goal line technology works really, really well, and it's worked pretty well from almost day one. Really, I think most people would acknowledge that it was required, and I think, you know, obviously there was a catalyst in the World Cup with Frank Lampard's goal against Germany, which wasn't given. And that was the
Garcia's ghost goal.
Exactly, yeah. And that was the sort of, that was the almost catalyst to really push that bandwagon forwards, if you like. People have talked about it for a long time, but it usually takes one incident, a high profile incident, to really, you know, push it over the line. Goal line technology works really, really well, because if the technology is accurate and it's accepted as accurate, in Premier League we use Hawkeye, for example, Hawkeye technology. At some point, either a ball is over a line or it's not over a line. It's very, very clear cut. And if the technology can measure to that millimeter, then fantastic, because that's a yes or no decision. Yeah, either it's over the line or it's not over the line. With VAR, the protocols around it are so important, because it's still a subjective decision on a number of occasions, you know. So, you know, we've seen it with various incidents in the Premier League, as Keith mentioned, since it was launched, and the Premier League tried to go their own way with some of the protocols, and it was removed from what was happening in other competitions, such as the World Cup, for example, which had come just before. You know, no pitch side monitors for the first, you know, well, almost 2/3 of the season, and referees encouraged not to go to the pitch side monitor. That was a big difference from what was happening in other leagues. And the reason for that is because obviously they wanted to minimise the impact on the speed of the game and the ball being in play and things like that. I completely understand why that decision was taken, but it is quite a big shift from what was happening around the world, really. Now we're seeing much more engagement with pitch side monitors, as Keith mentioned, you know, recent example with Anthony Taylor. And I think it's better for it. You know, the system is better. The player team, you know, you've got to sell that decision to the players as well. They have to believe that the process is accurate and that it's authentic, and that the decision that's arrived at is accurate and it's the right decision. If they do, that's fine. You know, then the game goes on. If they don't, then that's when you start to have a problem. And using pitch side monitors helps with that process, because they know the process that the referee's going through. They know that they're talking to another official and the VAR control room, and they're looking at other pictures and things like that. And then they're advised to go to the monitor if required. So I think that helps in terms of the acceptance of VAR. But it does take time, and you've only got to look at other sports when they've introduced technology to see that, you know, there is a bedding in process. Even, you know, sports like rugby union, rugby league, who have, you know, cricket as well. When they've introduced technology, it's taken time for that technology to bed into the game, and it isn't always accurate. It's not always 100% right in terms of the processes. If you look at cricket, hotspot was being used, for example, in terms of the technology, and what happened was players greased the edge of the bats, and then what they realized, if they greased the edge of the bat, it wouldn't detect whether the ball had touched the bat or not, and so it wasn't detecting it on hotspot, so that technology was removed. And sometimes, you know, it has to be done once the technology is part of the game. You know, it's an evolution, if you like, once the technology has been introduced. So it does take time, but you know, in the Premier League, I think we've seen improvements over the last certainly year or so. And this season's, you know, so far, I think it's been pretty good. I think most people would say that, particularly the offside decisions. So, you know, it does take time. And I think we can look at other sports to learn from that as well.
Amazing insights. I think you ended it pretty well, that it takes time, and it's better to learn from other sports who are like quite ahead in terms of use of technology. I just want to pull back to Keith in this aspect. So what's very interesting is recently Premier League has come up with a change in allowing more soft challenges and tackles, and enabling the game to flow without much interruptions. What do you think about the recent changes?
Well, I think that we saw this in UEFA. We saw this in the Euro 2020s, where we use the phraseology, a lighter touch. And in a way, it goes back to 1980 and 1990 in terms of refereeing style, where we as referees were encouraged to apply advantage to keep the game flowing at a high level. But the outcome of that was that we were seeing more players receiving injuries that were taking them out of the game for a period of time. So it's my view that I've seen some more relaxed form of refereeing generally, but when you operate a lighter touch, there has to be a massive buy-in by the players. The players have to have the discipline. And what we saw in Europe, in UEFA, was players in those games holding pretty good levels of discipline. Now, we're beginning to see some cracks. We're only into the third, fourth, we're coming up for the fourth week, if we like, in terms of fourth area. I've got one or two concerns, and that is that we've perhaps seen a couple of red card challenges getting yellow cards when in fact, you know, in my opinion, and it is my opinion, shared by others, there were excessive force that endangered the safety of an opponent. You know, as an example, I thought the challenge in the Burnley game by Ashley Barnes at Leeds United, he came in high, he was using force, and he endangered the safety of the opponent. He was lucky not to get a red card. So I think that I like the ability of the lighter touch. I'm concerned in two areas, and that is law application has to be law application, particularly on the bigger decisions. The clubs need to monitor the injury levels of players. And I think it's so important for the boss of the PGMOL and the Premier League itself to ensure that there is a good monitoring process, that we're not tipping over into that area where too much has been allowed. And as a result of that, players are sustaining long-term injury. Now, other than that, I think we in England are all enjoying the games because of the pace of the game. Now, against that, we've had two managers who've expressed concern that they feel that, I think it, you know, I can understand their concerns. A lot of goals, and I'm not going to give figures, but a lot of goals in the Premier League are scored from set pieces. We have wonderful players that can take and score goals from set pieces by wonderful free kicks. And we welcome back Cristiano Ronaldo because he's given us a number of masterclasses on how to take free kicks, and lots of players have learned from that. And this is why there are certain managers, you know, I can refer back to Arsene Wenger, who's now in charge of the development side within FIFA, the technical side. And I can remember a discussion with him that I had because he believed that every foul committed should result in a free kick. There was no area of grey. He wanted a free kick. And it's my belief that his reasoning behind that was he didn't want advantage played in and around the penalty area of the opposition. He wanted the set piece free kick. So this is where I think, you know, the development within the PGMOL, the fact that they're professional referees, the opportunity they can discuss, I think it's so important that the boss of the PGMOL maintains good contact with the clubs to get a feel and a feel as to whether, in fact, he's happy. The one area that's really concerning me is the increase amount of indiscipline of players surrounding the referee. And a week ago, we saw Chelsea surrounding the referee, 3, 4, 5 players. Now, in the past, when I was the boss of the PGMOL, we had a very clear protocol. 3 or more players surrounding the referee was a charge by the Football Association on that club for failing to control their players. I have yet to see the Football Association charge Chelsea with regard to failing to control their players. The level of dissent, if you like, by action from the referees warranted action post-match in a review. Now, I know everybody's against that, but I think that those are the sort of concerns. But let me tell you this. I think this has been, we're only 3 weeks into the competition. We are seeing our top referees being selected to officiate the games on a more consistent basis. And for me, they're delivering. The standard this year so far, and I know it's early, compared to what I was seeing last year, is a sea change that I really like. The other areas that concern me, if you like, are one of fatigue. You know, I'm pleased that we've increased the number of referees on the PGMOL to 20. I think that's the right move. It gives us 4 more referees. I think the likes of Michael Oliver, Anthony Taylor, Martin Atkinson, Mike Dean to some degree, were perhaps overexposed. You know, there's a point at which you have to monitor very carefully their recovery rates, remembering that Dean and Atkinson are 50 plus in terms of age. And therefore, I think there are times when I would suggest that we don't want a refereeing one on a Saturday and then being 4th official or VAR the following day. I want the actual action and the recovery of that individual to be 100%. So let's give him a couple of days to recover, to then set for the next game. So I think that, you know, we're not like players, referees in England or anywhere around the world. We're not going on a team bus or a team plane. Mm-hmm. We're having to travel by driving our own car from A to B to get to the game. And so the weekends for referees in England are pretty intense. And those referees at the top of our game, you know, I think Michael Oliver had somewhere in excess of, and Anthony Taylor had in excess of 50 games active, because they were also recognised by, quite correctly, by UEFA and FIFA as being the 2 best English referees. And they are our 2 elite referees on UEFA. So they're going to be used as well in Europe. So, you know, 40-odd games in the Premier League and then another up to 10 on the international scene is and yeah, they're professional, but at the same time, they're human beings, and the monitoring of recovery and the monitoring of their health is really vital in that process.
Okay. Yes, Keith. In fact, my follow-up question was actually based on this. You touched upon the intensity of referees going through, for example, a game in Saturday in Manchester and probably officiating a game in Merseyside in the next day. They go through a lot of intensity. So what fitness and health regimes are regularly followed by referees currently at elite level? Maybe Tom Webb, based on your researches, do you have something substantial to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, it does differ from country to country. I mean, you have the UEFA and FIFA standard test for those referees that are, you know, officiating in the Champions League, but also then the European Championships and the World Cup and things like that, when they have get-togethers every so often. So those referees will, you know, in a world without COVID generally, will travel to a certain location, would train together over a certain period of time. And that would be with the UEFA or FIFA instructors. And some of those will come from, you know, the associations and the countries and things like that. But FIFA and UEFA will have their certain directives. And you see that in every tournament as well, that there might be certain things that they're really looking for the referees to either enforce, or there's a certain way that they want them to officiate in a given circumstance, for example. So we can look at the different competitions to see those sorts of differences. And it does differ. As I said earlier, it does differ from competition to competition. There are certain instructions that might differ. And referees actually have to, quite often within a week, they might have to officiate relatively differently in sort of 3 competitions. Because if we take the Premier League, for example, a referee might be officiating in the Premier League one day, and they've got VAR, they've got goal line technology and everything that comes with it in the Premier League, in terms of how the game's played and officiated and things like that. They might then go and do a Champions League game or a Europa League game or something like that on a Wednesday or Thursday. Now, protocol is slightly different, the way that's approached is slightly different, the pace of the game slightly different, and so they have to change the performance to a certain extent to officiate that match. And as I've already talked about, the player behaviour is also slightly different. They might then come back and there might be an FA Cup game at the weekend, and it might be at a League 2 ground or a League 1 ground, and they don't have VAR and they don't have goal line technology, and it's a completely different way of preparation, of performance and things like that. So we're asking sometimes these elite referees to officiate quite differently on 3 different occasions within 1 week, and that's not atypical during a season. That happens relatively often in particularly in England, but also in other countries as well. So actually, we're asking quite a lot of them, that, in terms of what we expect in terms of their performance, their preparation, but also, as Keith mentioned, travel comes into that, fatigue around that, mental preparation, the technical preparation. Referees don't just generally, the majority that I've had any interaction with don't just walk onto a pitch with no preparation in terms of who they're officiating. They'll look at the teams, they'll look at players that might have moved between clubs, they'll look at where they might stand at corners, some of the issues that might have occurred previously, things like that. They don't go onto the pitch blind. There's preparation involved. So there's there are big differences there, which I think we see from competition to competition quite regularly. One of the things Keith touched on there as well, which I think is really important, is this idea of surrounding the referee, and we have seen a few more incidents of that recently. That's something I really would like to see removed, because it doesn't set a good example. It's not good for people watching at home, and it does have an effect lower down the playing spectrum, if you like. We know from the research we've done that referees and match officials in other sports say that if there's incidents in elite sport that's televised that are negative, they will see those consequences over the next few weeks on local pitches or playing areas on a Saturday and Sunday. And they're the ones that have to then deal with that negative behaviour. And we've got real issues around abuse of officials at all levels of the game, but particularly lower down where, if we take football as the example, you might have a 15-year-old referee who's officiating a youth game. There might be, lots and lots of parents around the pitch. This referee might be on their own. They're isolated. If things go wrong and verbal abuse, physical abuse starts to escalate, that's a very, very intimidating place for that referee to be. So I think we've really got to be careful as a sport to send the right message right from the top of the game, to help people at the bottom, because ultimately the referees we've talked about today, the Anthony Taylors, Mark Clattenburgs, Howard Webbs, Michael Olivers, all these guys, they've come from starting at Saturday and Sunday League local level at some point to get to that position. And so, we know that there's an issue with recruitment and retention in those lower levels. And this is across the world. This isn't just in England. There's issues in every country around the world. This isn't an issue that's unique to the UK. And it's not unique to football either. It happens in other sports, but football has its own challenges. And we have to be really, really careful with the message we're sending from the Premier League, from those elite leagues that are televised, because, we can't afford for more referees to leave the game. It's in quite a precarious position at the moment. I'm aware of a lot of fixtures that are being played, particularly at youth level now, without referees. There's not enough to go round. There's a lot of referees that are doing 3-4 matches over a weekend. And if they stop doing that, all of a sudden the number of matches without a recognised and qualified official goes up, substantially. And of course, recruitment in these challenging times is even more difficult because, over the last 18 months, courses haven't been able to run as they normally would. And the landscape that these referees are going into is vastly different now to what it used to be, in terms of any COVID protocols and things like that. So it's a very challenging time. And I think, going back to the point about people and players surrounding the referee, we've really got to be careful of the message we're sending.
I think Tom is absolutely correct. I'm president of a grassroots club. We have 22 teams. In fact, the shortage is such that a few weeks ago, we sat around the table and decided that we would pay for 6 people. We would recruit 6 people from our club. They didn't necessarily have to referee us, our club, but we would just put 6 referees into the system. The shortage is concerning. And I think it's so important that we dwell a little bit on that whole aspect of how referees at the top level have a duty of, if you like, to ensure that the game is played in the right manner, but not just the referees, the players themselves. And at times, I think that, you know, I'm critical personally when I see a decision. I'm asked to explain that decision, and quite often it's only centres around when the referee has made an error. But I try to expand that discussion to say, look, a referee is making several hundred decisions in a game. He doesn't blow his whistle every time. He's making a decision to keep the game flowing. He's making a decision to move into a position. So he's free-flowing with his decisions. And player behaviour is so important. And this escalation that I've seen, not only in Europe, I've seen it in recent cup games as well, in the current rounds of the World Cup. And I think that we've got to get to a position where players, clubs do understand the impact that it's having at grassroots level. I think that we probably started last season with a 10% shortfall. And remember, we've got 30,000 approximately referees. But I know, without knowing the knowledge, I think we're in the low 20,000s now, given the number of games that I see in local parks. You know, I spoke to an official last night who refereed one of our junior games. And this was his 4th game from Saturday. And that was like, I've gone, how many? And he's had 2 games on a Saturday, 1 on a Sunday. He did a part game on a Sunday because the referee was injured and he took over. So in effect, he had 4+ games over a period.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the old referee recruitment and retention, when you're so short and you stop filtering and encouraging people to become referees, you know, I've often said universities create the best source, or one of the best sources, for securing referees, because they need the money to go out and have a pint of beer or an extra spoonful of food. And football refereeing gives them that opportunity, you know. So I think it's quite a dilemma. I think the FA probably, in England at this moment in time, they might be aware of the shortfall. I'm not so sure they've got the full picture, because it is pretty dramatic. And Tommy's right. The impact of that is because of COVID, the lack of classes. But I'd make a plea. You know, at the moment, for a person to become a referee in most parts of the country, it's about £150. And I would just like the FA to drop that for a couple of seasons and try to recruit the numbers to get, you know, a game without a referee is a game that promotes problems for the next referee that comes along in discipline and all that goes with it.
Amazing. Keith and Tom, I mean, like, there was some excellent insights. I just want to touch upon this aspect. There are already challenges of recruitment and retaining referees, along with like abuses from players and abuses from fans, like not only just verbal abuses from the ground, or like it's the time of even social abuses. Like some decisions go up again, like probably there's something going on social media all the time. The referee could be on social media, or their families could be on social media, along with I would say even managers are at the ears of referees all the time when they're officiating as match officials. So considering all this, and along with the challenges of the fatigue and intensity of the games coming ahead, and the parities in the levels of the games, which you already touched about, do really we need to have mental health programs for referees also, because there are mental health programs for normal humans, mental health program for like players, which is talk so much. There talks of Naomi, talks of tennis players, talks of footballers. What about the mental health aspect of referees? What are the programs which are currently on?
Yeah, I mean, the FA have launched a pilot relatively recently called Mental Health Champions. which is relatively small scale. I think it's in about 15, maybe 20 county FAs, where they're looking to provide mental health support for referees. Now, I think that's great. I think that's a step forward. Absolutely, definitely, that's a good thing. But my worry is that we start to then deal with the issues, and we're not dealing with what's happening at source to create those problems. You know, why are they getting abused in the first place? If you know, yes, of course, these things will happen at times, and even if we get to a situation where we reduce abuse drastically, which needs to happen, there will still be some incidents of it. It's inevitable, I think. So yeah, we need stuff in place like the Mental Health Champion Scheme to deal with it when that happens. But ultimately, what we want to do is reduce those incidents down significantly so that it's not so arduous to deal with all these issues of referee abuse, physical, verbal abuse that happen, you know, week in, week out around not just the UK, but in other countries around the world as well. You know, it's going to stretch any governing body if it happens a lot, no matter what provisions you put in place. So I think we've really got to look at this root cause. Now, you talked about players and coaches, there's spectators as well. There's abuse at every level, and it's the type and scale of the abuse that differs. So, of course, the guys at the top of the game will still get abuse. That happens, particularly from the crowd, in effect. And you talked about social media. We've seen some very high-profile incidents on social media involving Michael Oliver, for example, over the last couple of years, where he got significant abuse, and so did his family. Also happened to Mike Dean. Mike Dean had to, you know, couldn't referee one weekend, for example, because of that abuse. That's completely unacceptable. You know, these guys should not be receiving threats like that. It's completely unacceptable, and it happens to players, and it's almost boiled over into, you know, towards officials as well. Now, Mike Dean has not got a personal Twitter account. The referees in the Premier League, the PGMOL, are not allowed to have a personal Twitter account for that very reason, you know, and yet he still received that abuse. So, and Michael Oliver, again, doesn't have that, but you know, it went to his wife and it went to his family, and they found out where he lived and things like that. And I mean, they should not be fearing for their safety. That is completely unacceptable. So we've got to look at why these things happen in the first place and what we can do to mitigate that. Now, my worry is with some of the schemes and things, yes, it deals with those issues further down the line, but we want to stop that before it gets to that point. So what can we do to do that? And I think that's what we need to focus on. But mental health support is vital. And I think it's particularly vital for new and young referees. You know, as I said, it can be an isolating place. It can be quite lonely. You know, you might be on a pitch in a local park, and it might be you and the youth players you're refereeing and all their parents and coaches and everything. There could be 40, 50 people and you know, and if that goes wrong, that's quite an intimidating place to be. So I think we really need to be mindful of the situation that we put some of these guys in. We know that in other countries there are schemes that are in place. There are various mechanisms that they put in place to try and reduce abuse. The Netherlands is a good example. The KNVB, the association in the Netherlands, have been really proactive in trying to reduce it. And certainly from our research, we've conducted research around Europe, around the world. We worked with the Dutch FA, and their abuse levels are lower than they are here. Absolutely. Definitely, that is the case there, and it's because of some of the procedures and some of the policy changes they've put in place. Now, the reason that they put those in place was, unfortunately, they had a tragedy in the Netherlands where an assistant referee was attacked and killed at a youth game. It was a parent who was just helping out, and of course that led to significant soul-searching changes in policy and things like that from within the Netherlands. And we don't want to get to that. We don't want that to happen. That's, you know, that's not what you want. You don't want a tragedy like that to really drive any changes. You want it to come in so that, you know, that it doesn't happen in the first place. And we should be looking at those countries that have done things that we can learn from. And vice versa, we should be sharing information. Keith talks, for example, about, you know, he went and looked at other sports and what they were doing and things like that. That doesn't happen enough. There's not as much information sharing as there should be between, you know, officiating organisations in football, in rugby union, in rugby league. You know, abuse is a problem that cuts across sports. So let's look at the challenge collectively. Let's see what we can do. Let's learn from what's worked in some sports and what hasn't worked in some sports. Let's learn what works in other countries and what hasn't worked in other countries. And then, you know, if we work collectively, I think we'd have much more success in dealing with the problem at the sort of root cause.
I think that I support 100% what Thomas said, that you cannot have a young referee abused in any way on the field of play. It's almost become, I think, the norm, that it's acceptable when it shouldn't be. You know, Mal Lee with Don't Cross the Line in Liverpool came up with the idea of a set of posts 1 metre from the touchline and almost, if you like, a mental wall created to stop parents encroaching onto the field of play. I think sometimes I shudder for our younger referees because, again, I worry about the amount of training that they receive to prepare them for these outbursts. And I also think that at times abusing the referees is part of the game. It's tradition. It's acceptable when it's totally not. So I share Tom's view. I think that we can all come up with different remedies. I've seen cases of physical abuse not being dealt with appropriately, either by the police in England or by the FA, you know, where players who've created a physical abuse on a referee have been allowed to continue to play the game. For me, that's over the top and therefore, yes, draconian. But I can remember years ago, after I'd refereed a semi-final of a football match in a grassroots level when I was a younger referee, the goalkeeper and the fan exchanged abusive messages, and then it escalated into almost a fist fight. Difficult to find the fan, but he got suspended from being able to attend football matches. Difficult to police. But the player who got involved in that, he was signed out. His career was over. Now, okay, regarded as draconian, but I can tell you in the following years, the impact was great because players recognized that that might be the outcome. It might not, but it might be the outcome. So I think that the game really, all particular participants in the game, and those that hold, if you like, the licenses of the referees, have to support measures that actually stop this escalation that I'm seeing now. It's not tomorrow it will happen. It's happening now. You know, I attend Referees Association meetings. I give lectures. I'm obviously active on social media. I was never physically abused on a football field. But going back to my informative years, 12 years at grassroots level, I think that would have impacted greatly on me as an individual. And, you know, when we've got younger kids taking up the whistle, both male and female now, I think that's got to be even greater awareness that we need to protect these individuals. So it's a cancer in the game that is beginning to escalate and worrying. And as a result, somebody's got to have a picture that says they're walking away from the game saying, I don't need it, you know? And I think more care and responsibility needs to be taken. And somehow, you know, we as a club at Penistone Church, you know, with all these teams, we take this very seriously. You know, I saw a fan at a game last week beginning to question a referee's decision. The referee wasn't having probably his best game, but at the level he was at, he's doing a good job. You know, he's refereeing a football match. And we're lucky to have that individual do the job. And I just say, look, players make mistakes, they're forgiven. Referees make mistakes, they're not. And they hang on to them. So I'm really passionate about how the game is moving. And I want the mix in refereeing. I don't, you know, I want the guy who goes to university. I want the guy who goes to secondary school. I want the girl who's gone to university. I want her to have a safe introduction into the game so that ultimately, you know, we do refereeing one thing. We do it for enjoyment. Mm-hmm. That's our first basis of refereeing. And so I think that, for me, the alarm bells have been ringing for some time. And that's why I mentioned Chelsea, surrounding players, no action. And then I look at the other side, and that's the responsibility of the referee. The referee must apply the laws. And if he is abused, there's a system in which to report it. You know, last week, we saw England play Hungary in an international game where there was clearly abuse, and it was racially motivated. And we had one of the most experienced referees out on the field of play. And behind him is a match delegate representing FIFA. Now, whilst FIFA may not have the three-part process that's introduced by UEFA, that UEFA process of step 1, step 2, step 3, in dealing with racial abuse, didn't come into play when it should have done. You know, that step 1 process, when you see things being thrown, and okay, dismissive cardboard cups, it's not going to hurt anyone. Look, hiding behind that cardboard cup could be a missile that will hurt someone and potentially kill someone. So in that situation, I was disappointed that either the referee or the match delegate that was operating at that game on behalf of FIFA didn't bring in step 1. The step 1 is a simple process, an announcement to the crowd, you know, that it's been recognised what is happening and action will be taken. Step 2 is you bring the players off. So I think that there is a process in place. Referee, please use it. And if someone is representing that competition, let's use it. I think referees have got to use the sin bin more. I've seen it at grassroots level. It works. I was watching a match on Saturday, not involving our teams, but involving a game with my grandson. And 2 players on his team, because of a lack of discipline, were sent to the sin bin. And the referee was 100% correct. And then the manager started abusing the referee, and he was given the red card. And then I was asked for my views. And I was 100% supporting the referee. He'd taken the actions that were afforded to him, but he was then at risk of the threat, of the physical approach that might sustain. So referees have got to operate and enjoy it and not operate in fear. And we might regard it as smaller numbers, but 1 is 1 too many being assaulted.
Right. I mean, like, I think it's a brilliant masterclass of evolution of refereeing, along with the challenges which are being faced. And also people like Tom Webb, who's constantly working to spread the awareness, but also try and force changes with the bodies governing this. So I think it is a great end to the conclave with such a session, which is actually aimed at improving the overall conduct of the game, but also on the people who conduct the game. So thank you so much, Keith, and thank you so much, Tom. And it was lovely having you here. Hopefully we'll have you in the next year as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.